Welcome, church, to our YouTube channel. So, we have brought another topic. From my experience, what I found was through YouTube videos, through going to different churches, is that churches are no longer focusing on the substance, not giving the raw material or the raw meat. They are providing milk. And essentially, what that means is that they are more towards gaining attention of people, bringing in that wow movement rather than providing you with clean, organized study material. So we have moved away further and further away from giving a sermon in the form of a study material and moved more and more towards providing less and less of material but having a wow effect, having an amazing effect. They're more focused on their enunciation, they're more focused on presenting a show, but they're not willing to give you proper material. And so this is why we have made a humble effort to essentially discuss those topics which you won't find easily on YouTube. I personally went on YouTube, tried searching on certain topics, and when I was disappointed, I thought that I should make this initiative to present these topics in the light of Bible as how Bible describes them. And an important topic that you will find, especially in this century, is the topic of deception. More and more pastors are talking about worldly deception, but less and less on what it really means. How does Satan deceive us? How does Satan try to deceive a believer? So basically, if we look at this very word deception, it is to trick someone. It is to provide an information that catches on to their attention, to divert, to basically either inflict them in a certain way, to move further and further away from truth. So opposite of deception is to be in the light of God, or to be in truth. There are three forms of deception. The very classic form essentially is how you would see on YouTube. They talk about fake news. You have heard on so many YouTube channels about politicizing certain political topics that may or may not be affecting their church. So, if they are not even affecting their church, why are they talking about it? Wow movement. Because they want to bring in that wow movement rather than focusing on what will bring productivity in their church, in their environment. More and more focus is on politicizing topics, bringing in those political topics, and that is scratching the surface of this topic of deception, but not going further into it and explaining why and how things work. So that's the first form of deception, which is classic YouTube or classic topics where they would bring in, oh, so we're talking about abortion. Of course, these topics are important biblically, but this is how deception works because they talk about fake news. And these things are in to a greater extent they're not affecting church very massively. The second form of deception that Bible describes and is neglected in discussions on, if you go to YouTube channel, listen to a YouTube video, they will not cover this topic, but Bible covers it. And so we are talking about people who are like storytellers. They would be saying a story, and their yes doesn't mean a yes, their no doesn't mean a no. So in Bible, Jesus clearly describes, let your yes be a yes and let your no be a no. And anything else comes from the devil. So this is essentially the the basic description of how truth is swayed by storytelling. In this, we cover how different theologies have formed, where there would be an emotional appeal, let's say an eternal family. Bible describes that after we leave this earth, our temporary residence, there won't be eternal families. But people who want to hear about eternal families, they will bring in this deception in their theology. So deception isn't just theology. This is one of the forms of deception. Uh, And then the third major form of deception is the element of malice. The element, and this is mostly in relation to ignorance, because people think, or we see in Bible that people think that they won't be held accountable for their what they say, what they do. They build traps for their neighbors. They're not loving. They're unkind. Basically, they're trying to trick people. One important thing to mention in this particular aspect is the aspect of bearing false witness. And this is where even those who go on street and you see them, they're talking about Christ's witness, they're trying to talk about God's love, but they're not emulating Christ's love. They are not showing the light. And in Bible, Christ clearly says, if the salt loses its flavor, it's not worthy of anything. It's really not beneficial. It is to be trampled on. And a city built on a hill should not be hidden. Everything will be exposed on the day of judgment. But you see, people would go around talking about love, Christ's love, but they are not promoting Christ's love. Instead, when you go further into probing their minds, probing how they see things, you'll see myriads of, like, lots of fear that they have developed, a lot of walls that they have developed around themselves, and that shows that there is false witness. They're not bearing true witness of Christ's love. So in basic concept of sin, whenever a sin is exposed, there would be a guilt feeling. But guilt feeling is not same as a massive fear that falls on a person, which we'll see in most cases. If deception is involved, there would be fear involved. So there are people in Bible, example Sodom and Gomorrah, they were sinning, but they were not afraid of sinning. Why? Because they were blatantly sinning. And that doesn't involve in a concept of deception. They are deceived in their minds, but they are not deceived in the way that someone brought them wrong news. They were willingly, blatantly sinning. So in terms of sinning, it can lead to fear. It can lead to certainly lead to guilt, but it's not necessary that sin would be associated with fear. But guilt conscious is just acknowledgement of knowing that you have sinned. However, fear is an overpowering of your mind, overpowering of what would happen. You learn to fear situations, and you learn to fear people. And this is one of the biggest weapons that the enemy can use against you. And this is exactly what Satan wants. It wants to stir up fear about situations, stir up fear about people. So more and more people are essentially afraid of presenting the true love for one another, bringing the productivity for one another, and there's less and less work that is being done for Christ. So when we consider certain examples, I'll give you example how deception is tied into fear, but sin is tied into mostly guilt and doesn't always cause fear. When Adam and Eve, they were deceived by the serpent, we see that after they knew that they had sinned, there was an extreme fear. They hid from God. They covered themselves with leaves, with fig leaves. Why? Because that fear came because of the deception that Satan had brought. When we talk about it in the book of Jeremiah, we see that Jeremiah was hit by who? There's a priest whose name is Pashur. And so Pashur hits Jeremiah. Why? Because Jeremiah exposed the deception that Pashur was preaching to all the people around. So whenever there is deception, later on Jeremiah says, Lord says so about Pashur, that you would be terror to everyone, and you would be terror for yourself also. So there is a great sense of guilt and fear that would surround you. We see also in Achan, in the book of Joshua that Achan stole what was to be destroyed. Achan found a nice Babylonian robe and some money, and then he went and stole and hid it from God. And so God tells Joshua in chapter 12, starting from verse 11 and 12, it says, God tells Joshua that Israel stole from him, from God. And because of this, Israel doesn't stand up against its enemy now. So there's an extreme fear that develops into Israel. It's afraid of its enemy while it was already gaining all the victories. Now, because of that fear that developed in the people, they would be, because of that deception that was created by Achan, there is a continued fear that resulted in it. And then we cover in the book of in the story of Hezekiah, how Hezekiah, a very good or righteous king, and so even when the prophet Isaiah brings a seemingly negative news to Hezekiah, but because Hezekiah was not a deceiver, because Hezekiah's heart was not into deceiving people and not into deceiving God, we see that when Isaiah brings bad news that your kids would be taken to Babylon, everything would be stolen to Babylon, and you would lose everything. This is what Hezekiah says: the message you brought to me from Lord was good. Why? Because his mind was not deceived, because there was no deception. So even when there is bad news that comes, because there is no deception, there is no fear. We see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 to verse 10, midwives that were told by Pharaoh to drown, or sorry, not to drown, but to kill all the babies that were born, male babies that were born to Israelites. But these midwives, they deceived the Pharaoh, and so they weren't actually killing the babies. They were not afraid of the situation, they were afraid of God. So a point to be noted here is that we are to be afraid of God. We are not to be afraid of situations. We are not to be afraid of people that deception brings. What does deception do? It creates fake news. It creates information about people, about situation, that something would happen, and all that basically treachery, all the trickery that goes on, it reduces the yield for Christ. We see in the book of Second Kings by King Jehu in chapter 10 verse 19, Jehu deceives prophets of Baal. Why? Because he wants to trap them. He wants to trap them and put them to death. And when he does that, he is not afraid. Even though this is also a form of deception, but because he feared God, this deception doesn't lead him to fear. So that's very important to understand. When God deceives people, in the sense that God puts a lying spirit, in example of we see here in the story of King Ahab, that God asks in the presence of all the angels who would go and trick Ahab. And so a lying spirit comes forward, and God tells, yes, you can go and trick Ahab into going into a war at Ramoth Gilead. And so when Ahab asked a particular prophet, Micaiah, Ahab says, everyone else may still lie, but Micaiah would not speak good of me just for the sake of speaking good for him. So we see that Micaiah was not a deceiving prophet, and the deceiving spirit had worked through all the prophets of Baal to give him wrong information of going forward and that he would win the war. And in actuality, what happens is Ahab is killed. We also go further with this with certain verses in Proverbs chapter 6 verse 16 to 19, one of the 7 things that God hates, and that's a lying tongue, quick to do evil, bearing false witness. All these three things are described there. So God hates deception. That leads to evil in and evil in the sight of God, not evil in sight of people, but evil in sight of God. And then in Proverbs chapter 24 verse 28, don't testify against neighbor without cause. Why? Because you don't want to be misleading, and that's also evil in eyes of God. In Psalm chapter 101 verse 7, deceitful will not enter heaven. In Galatians chapter 6, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. So in all things we learn that in different forms of deception, one is just a classic YouTube definition where they try to bring topics that aren't even affecting the church actively in their particular surrounding, and they're talking these topics just to create a fear, just to create a wow movement. That is also a form of deception. Why? Because imagine this, if Paul, instead of writing letters that were focused on things that were required for those churches, had he not spoken those things and given a story of what's going on in a different country or different settings, or what's going on in political arena, but not actively working on those churches, you would not call them work of God. Why? Because work of God is essentially required to correct you and to move you towards His will. So we further understand that with the concept of deception, there is an element of fear tied into it, but not when you deceive, or when we see the stories where where deception was in the will of God, where God had purposely deceived to punish. But when we consider the topic of just sin, there may not be fear. Why? Because sin can lead to guilt, but overpowering fear that mostly comes through is only through deception. So we'll be continuously bringing you certain topics that you would not find actively being spoken on, actively being discussed on YouTube channel. And it is important for our churches in this time, in this end of the times, that we have to focus on the important topics and bring clear biblical understanding of these topics, rather than going after a fluff, rather than trying to be impressive, rather than trying to put up a show. We don't want all those things. Why? Because they don't bring productivity for God. And as soldier of Christ, we are supposed to be actively working, actively marching towards truth. And that's what we really are striving to do. I would encourage you all to support this channel so we can work further together in promoting God's work. Thank you.